Halo semua, selamat sore. Selamat datang di diskusi ketiga dan terakhir kita dari rangkaian Authors Forum untuk Jakarta International Literary Festival 2025. Nah, diskusi kita pada sore ini, yaitu There's a Palestine Inside All of Us, menekankan bahwa urusan Palestina sudah melampaui batas negara dan politik kekuasaan, menjadi urusan inti kemanusiaan setiap individu, dan juga menyoroti manipulasi fakta dan narasi yang dilakukan oleh pemerintah Israel. Nah, mari kita akan bahas tuntas bagaimana caranya supaya kita bisa menjadi bagian dari suara kemanusiaan ini. Moderator kita pada sore ini adalah Andina Dwi Fatma, Doktor Antropologi Media, penulis kolom dan novel. Kita sambut dengan tepuk tangan meriah Mbak Andina Dwi Fatma.
Thank you everyone, terima kasih. Welcome to the panel. The title is There's a Palestine Inside All of Us. This panel invites us to reflect on how Palestine is not only a geographic reality, but also a shared metaphor for struggle, memory, and resilience that lives within each of us. Sebelumnya, pengumuman dulu titipan dari panitia tadi, kita ada jasa penerjemahan link Zoom melalui link Zoom. Mungkin bisa di-share nanti di screen. Yeah, if you guys are interested in the translation service, please go to this link. And for those of you who doesn't bring an earpiece, I think kita ada di sini. Yang membutuhkan bisa raise hand. For those of you who need an earpiece, you can raise your hand and the committee will share it with you. Tidak ada? Oke, baiklah. Okay, cool. We have 3 panelists with us right now. To my left, Anthony Lowenstein. Please welcome. Did I say it right? Lowenstein. And then Walid Jumlat Abdullah. And then Zulfa Nur Alimah. I'm going to read their short bio for all of us. Zulfa Nur Alimah completed her master's degree in Arabic literary criticism at Al-Azhar University, Cairo in 2021. Her first translation of an Arabic novel, Letters of the Night by Hoda Barakat, was published in 2022. Since then, she has been actively translating various other Arabic novels, including 2 works by Palestinian authors, Minor Details by Adenia Shibli, and The Curse of the Palestinian Boy by Mazen Maruf. She currently works as a freelance translator and editor, and is the mother of a son named Daniel. Is Daniel here with us right now? Oh, no. Okay. The next one, we have Walid Jumlat Abdullah. He's an associate professor in politics at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He is the author of the best-selling book, Why Palestine? Reflections from Singapore. Walid is the host of a political podcast called Teh Tarik with Walid, where he hosts politicians and political influencers to have discussions on the important socio-political issues of the day. And last but not least, we have Anthony. Anthony Lowenstein is an independent Australian-German journalist, best-selling author, filmmaker, and co-founder of Declassified Australia. He's written for The Guardian, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, and many others. His books include the global bestseller The Palestine Laboratory, which is also a podcast and award-winning film series, and it's just out in Indonesia with the publisher Magazine Kiri. His other books include Pills, Powder, and Smoke, Disaster Capitalism, My Israel Question, After Zionism, One State for Israel and Palestine, and the Al Jazeera English films West Africa's Opioid Crisis, Under the Cover of COVID, and Germany's Israel Obsession. Before we go into question and answer session with the panelists, I would like to welcome the 3 of you to give such opening remarks, and we will start with Zulfa. I'm going to give Zulfa the first opportunity. Zulfa has slides for all of us, and I think should we, the 3 of us, yeah, so that okay.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everybody. It's such an honor to be here. It's such an honor to be here with all of you, with Mbak Andina, and also with Anthony and Wali Jumat Abdullah. This is my first time to be in Taman Ismail Marzuki. So thanks to Jilf for making it happen for me. And also thank you for bringing Palestine into this forum because we need uh, keep talking about Palestine in recent days. And in this lovely evening, I would like to talk about Palestine in my capacity as a literary translator or just a literature fans. But for the clarity and the safety of this discussion, I would like to talk in Indonesian. um, Selamat sore semuanya. Sore, senang sekali. Jujur saja saya sedikit gugup. Ini pertama kali biasanya saya kalau ada acara diskusi itu online, ini offline, jadi sedikit gugup. Langsung saja, di sore kali ini saya akan membahas tentang sastra sebagai sebuah perlawanan. Dalam sepanjang sejarah perjuangan Palestina, sastra itu selalu hadir sebagai alat perlawanan. Misalnya saja, sebelum Nakba, para penyair itu menghadirkan puisi-puisi yang gamblang, puisi-puisi yang minim metafora, karena memang pesan harus segera disampaikan, keadaan begitu darurat, dan tidak ada waktu untuk bermenung-menung. Misalnya saja, seorang penyair Palestina, sebenarnya dia berasal di Lebanon. Dia bernama Wadi Al-Bustani. Dia mewanti-wanti masyarakat tentang ancaman masifnya kedatangan para imigran Yahudi Eropa ke Palestina. Dia mengatakan seperti ini. Ajal, abirul urdun kana ibna ammina, walakinna nartabu min abil bahar. Benar, pelancong Yordania itu adalah sepupu kita. Tapi kita sangsi, pelancong dari lautan sana, maksudnya adalah imigran Yahudi Eropa. Ayah juru auruba liyabnya baitahu fawqa qubbatin bainal mahdi wal qabri. Apakah dia meninggalkan Eropa untuk membangun rumahnya di atas sebuah kubah antara tempat turunnya Mahdi dan makam-makam. Makam-makam di sini maksudnya adalah makam leluhur Palestina. Nah, sebenarnya melalui puisi ini dia tidak bertele-tele karena memang ingin memberikan situasi yang sedang terjadi saat itu. Jadi kita bisa melihat minim sekali metafora dalam puisi ini. Dan jika perlawanan bersenjata, kita bisa melihat bentuk konfrontasinya, ada persinggungannya. Perlawanan sastra itu terjadi dalam senyap, karena dia terjadi di sini dan terjadi di sini. Kerja sastra itu adalah menghentak kesadaran kita dan juga menyalakan bara api yang harusnya selalu menyala di dalam diri kita. Saya ingin beri contoh, misalnya tokoh dalam novel Ghossan Kanafani yang berjudul Rijalun ila Syams, atau bahasa Inggrisnya itu Man in the Sun. Ini novel menceritakan tentang 3 pengungsi Palestina yang mengungsi di Irak, dan mereka ingin memperbaiki hidup ke Kuwait yang saat itu sudah mulai maju dengan penemuan minyaknya seperti itu. Ya, seperti yang dialami para pengungsi Palestina, mereka tidak memiliki dokumen resmi, sehingga untuk pergi ke Kuwait mereka harus diselundupkan atau ilegal lah. Dan mereka diselundupkan melalui truk tangki gitu, tangki air. Tapi di tengah gurun pasir mereka mati karena kepanasan dan kehausan. Di akhir cerita, si supir truk itu berkata, 5 dalam yaduku judronal khozan. Kenapa sih mereka itu tidak mengetuk dinding tangki? Melalui tokoh ini, Ghossan Kanafani ingin menyuarakan bahwa kita yang tertindas, atau ya kita yang tertindas, kalau kita tertindas jangan cuma diam, tapi melawan. Dia ingin menghentakkan kesadaran kita tentang hal itu. Kemudian juga ada satu contoh lagi yang saya ingin bagikan kepada teman-teman, yaitu puisinya Abdurrahim Mahmud. Dia adalah seorang penyair Palestina yang digelari dengan Syairul Fursan. penyair kesatria. Kenapa? Karena dia tidak hanya menggubah kata-kata, dia turun langsung ke medan perang dan menjadi seorang martir pada perang Asyajarah di tahun 1947. Dia mengatakan dalam puisinya terkenal yang berjudul Asyahid, yaitu martir, yang mengatakan Sa'ahbilu ruhi ala rohati wa alqabiha fi mahawir roda. Akan kugenggam jiwaku di telapak tangan, lalu kulempar ke jurang kematian. Fa imma hayatun tasurus sadiq wa imma mamatun yagidul ida. Entah hidup yang bahagiakan kawan atau mati yang buat murka lawan. Wa nafsu syarif laha ghayatan wurudul manaya wa nailul munah. Jiwa yang mulia cuma ada dua pilihan, hadapi maut atau raih impian. Melalui bait puisi ini, Abdurrahim Mahmud ingin membuat kita menyala-nyala gitu. Dia ingin mengatakan bahwa merebut tanah air adalah harga mati yang tidak bisa ditawar, dan bagi rakyat Palestina ataupun mereka yang tanah airnya terampas hanya ada dua pilihan, entah mati atau terus berjuang demi meraih impian, yaitu sampai tanah air bisa dimerdekakan. Dan saya pikir saya setuju dengan pendapat Ghossan Kanafani dalam bukunya Al-Adab Al-Muqawim Al-Falistini, Al-Adab Al-Falistini Al-Muqawim, Sastra Palestina Perlawanan, di mana dia mengatakan perlawanan sastra itu tidak kalah penting dari perlawanan bersenjata. Karena perlawanan sastra itu yang menjadikan aksi perjuangan itu memiliki ruhnya, yang menjadikan perjuangan itu menyala dan memiliki artinya. Pada Intifada pertama di tahun 1984 ya kalau tidak salah. Ya, 1987 pada Intifada pertama rakyat Palestina membacakan di jalanan puisi Mahmud Darwish yang berjudul Ala hadhil ardi ma yustahaqul haya. Di atas tanah ini ada alasan untuk hidup. Dan kalau teman-teman tahu, mungkin teman-teman sudah familiar juga karena video ini cukup viral, di mana bait puisi ini yang dibacakan oleh Benedict Cumberbatch dalam acara konser yang diadakan untuk solidaritas bagi teman-teman kita yang ada di Gaza. Dan karena besarnya kekuatan sastra ini, penjajah Israel itu gigit jari. Mereka melakukan berbagai macam upaya untuk memadamkan geliat literasi di kalangan masyarakat Palestina. Misalnya dengan melarang bahasa Arab, misalnya dengan membatasi akses dan ketersediaan buku di sana. Di mana Adenia Shibli, kalau teman-teman familiar, dia seorang novelis, dia menuliskan sebuah artikel yang berjudul Khorijal Waqti, di luar waktu, yang diterbitkan di portal Al-Arabi Al-Jadid, News Arabic, di mana dia mengatakan pengalamannya dulu, menceritakan ketika sekolah SD itu sastra Palestina dilarang untuk diajarkan kepada murid-murid. Tapi lucunya sastra Arab lain itu boleh diajarkan, di mana buku pelajaran pada saat itu memang dikontrol oleh Israel, dan Israel takut kalau generasi muda itu jadi melek terhadap kondisi yang sebenarnya terjadi dengan tanah air mereka. Di mana kata Adenia Shibli, kalau puisi Palestina itu diperlakukan seperti halnya Al-Adab Al-Ibahi, bacaan porno gitu, dilarang, disensor. Kemudian juga ada cerita dari Atif Abu Saif dalam Diary of Genocide. Dia menceritakan dulu sebelum Israel menarik para pemukim Yahudi dari Gaza di tahun 2005, Israel sering melakukan penggeledahan buku. Dan buku-buku favorit yang dicari, diincar adalah karya-karya Ghossan Kanafani dan juga bukunya Salah Kholaf yang berjudul Palestine Bilahwiyah, A Palestinian Without Identity. Buku itu membicarakan tentang bagaimana proses terbentuknya Fatah, kemudian perang gerilya yang dilakukan, dan juga sejumlah operasi-operasi rahasia yang dilakukan, serta juga membahas fase-fase penting dalam sejarah perjuangan Palestina seperti hanya Black September, Al-Aidul Al-Aswad, di mana itu merupakan suatu tragedi yang memilukan karena harus terjadi peperangan antara rakyat Yordania atau militer Yordania dengan Palestina. Gitu. Dan ketersediaan akses buku ini semakin buruk ya setelah terjadinya genosida 2023 lalu, di mana misalnya di Gaza rumah-rumah penerbitan itu hancur lebur, seperti halnya ada Sami Mansur, kemudian ada tempat penerbitan yang bernama Darul Kalimah, itu adalah tempat penerbitan yang menerbitkan karya-karya sastrawan Gaza muda. Sejak genocide, ratusan ribu buku milik mereka itu sudah menjadi abu. Dan keadaan di tepi barat itu tidak lebih baik, walaupun di sana banyak tempat penerbitan seperti halnya Darul Syuruk, Darul Failaq, Darul Ru'ad dan lain sebagainya, tapi mereka struggling untuk bisa bertahan. Di tengah kita tahu kondisi keamanan yang tidak stabil, kondisi ekonomi dengan semua represi yang dilakukan oleh Israel, sehingga ya kita bisa membayangkan lah, mereka sepertinya tidak kepikiran untuk membeli buku, untuk membaca buku, lebih memikirkan bertahan gimana rumahnya tidak digusur, seperti itu. Tapi menariknya adalah walaupun dengan semua keadaan yang sulit ini, sastra Palestina itu tidak pernah mati. Palestina itu tidak pernah kehilangan, tidak pernah kehabisan sastrawannya. Dan yang menarik lagi adalah bahwa pesan perjuangan, pesan perlawanan itu justru yang menjadikan sastra Palestina memiliki coraknya tersendiri, yang membuatnya berbeda dari sastra Arab lainnya secara umum, di mana sastra Palestina itu dikenal dengan al-adab al-muqawim, sastra perlawanan gitu. Dan kalau kita lihat para sastrawannya memang selalu menghadirkan Palestina di dalam karya-karya mereka. Jadi secara tidak langsung mereka menciptakan gerakan sastra yang berkomitmen atau yang dinamakan dengan harokah adabiyah multazimah gitu. Dan ada seorang nasionalis Palestina bernama Mansur Kardushi, dia memberikan fatwa. Jadi dia mengatakan bahwa para sastrawan, para seniman itu wajib untuk menghadirkan pesan perjuangan dalam karya-karya mereka. Karena menurutnya karya-karya yang tidak mempermasalahkan dan tidak menyinggung permasalahan umat adalah karya-karya yang ada di era feudalisme, ada di era kemakmuran yang sangat tidak cocok dengan kondisi yang ada di Palestina. Tapi menurut saya, tanpa Mansur Kardushi memberikan fatwa seperti itu, secara alamiah para penulis Palestina tidak bisa untuk tidak menghadirkan Palestina dalam karya mereka. Kita bisa melihat nama-nama yang berada di luar Palestina, seperti halnya Nasrullah Ibrahim yang tinggal di Yordania, kemudian Murid Barghouti yang tinggal di Mesir, kemudian ada juga Mazin Ma'ruf yang tinggal di Swedia, dan masih banyak lainnya. Walaupun mereka jauh dari Palestina, tapi karya-karya mereka selalu menghadirkan Palestina. Jadi dengan kata lain, mereka tidak bisa meninggalkan akar kepalestinaan mereka. Dan yang ingin saya garis bawahi terkait dengan hal ini adalah meskipun para sastrawan Palestina itu sangat memperhatikan pesan perjuangan ya dalam karya-karya mereka, tapi mereka tidak mengabaikan bentuk artistik sastra itu sendiri. Jadi pesan ideologis itu tidak menunggangi keutuhan dan keharmonisan karya sastra Palestina. Kita bisa melihat Ghosn Kanafani melakukan berbagai macam eksperimen dalam karya-karyanya. Kemudian juga ada Adine Shibli yang juga melakukan berbagai macam eksperimen untuk menghadirkan bagaimana seharusnya pesan perjuangan itu dihadirkan tapi tetap estetik, tidak keluar dari tidak keluar dari norma-norma kesusastraan seperti itu. Dan kita bisa melihat bahwa nama-nama sastrawan Palestina seperti halnya Mahmud Darwish, kemudian Sami Qasim itu dalam bidang puisi. Kemudian ada juga Ghosn Kanafani, Jabro Ibrahim Jabro dalam bidang prosa, kemudian ada Taufik Fayad untuk naskah drama. Mereka semua adalah nama-nama yang berhasil membawa kebaruan dalam kesusastraan Arab secara umum, tidak hanya sastra Palestina. Dan ini sesuai dengan yang dikatakan oleh Ghosn Kanafani dalam bukunya yang tadi saya sebut, yang sempat kebalik, Al-Adab Al-Palestini Al-Muqawim tadi. Dia mengatakan justru pesan perjuangan itu yang mendorong para sastrawannya untuk meningkatkan kualitas mereka. Dia meneliti Mahmud Darwish sebelum Mahmud Darwish membicarakan tentang Palestina, dan setelah dia membicarakan Palestina, bagaimana terjadi peningkatan kualitas yang luar biasa, gimana kita bisa lihat dan kita bisa nikmati karya-karya Mahmud Darwish sekarang yang bergaya naratif, bahasanya sederhana tapi syarat dengan makna, dan bahasa yang mudah itu yang bisa diterima oleh masyarakat luas itu yang menjadikan Mahmud Darwish dianggap sebagai South Palestine, suara Palestina. Dan saya pikir juga Palestina akan selalu hadir dalam karya-karya sastrawan Palestina, karena Palestina itu adalah rumah, tempat kembali dengan seluruh kenangan yang ada di dalamnya. Mau kemanapun kita pergi, kita akan selalu kembali ke rumah. Dan juga saya ingat ada sebuah frasa yang mengatakan, saya lupa saya mendapatkan ini dari mana, kalau tidak salah dalam buku Zaman Nusyiri karya Adonis, kata-katanya seperti ini: Palestina itu seperti halnya udara, di mana manusia tidak bisa hidup tanpa menghirup udara, dan para sastrawan juga tidak bisa hidup kalau tidak membicarakan tentang Palestina. Dan untuk mereka yang tanah airnya terampas, rumah itu dekat tapi juga jauh pada waktu bersamaan. Dekat, dan gambaran ini tuh tercapture secara akurat dalam bait puisinya Mahmud Darwish. Saya bacakan: Ana min hunak, aku dari sana. Wali dikroyat, aku banyak kenangan di sana. Wulitu kamatu ladunas, aku lahir layaknya manusia lain lahir. Li walidah wa baitun kasirun nawafid, aku punya ibu dan rumah yang banyak jendelanya. Li ikhwah asdiqa wa sijnun binafidatin baridah, aku punya saudara-saudara, teman-teman, dan penjara dengan jendela yang dingin. Palestina itu dekat karena itu adalah tempat kelahiran mereka, karena itu adalah tempat di mana ibu mereka berada, tempat di mana saudara-saudara dan teman-teman mereka berada. Tapi pada waktu yang bersamaan, Palestina itu jauh, karena Palestina secara fisik, secara perlahan dia lenyap, dia terkikis dengan aneksasi yang tidak dihentikan oleh Israel di tepi barat ataupun di Gaza seperti yang kita lihat sekarang. Dan apa yang dilakukan oleh para sastrawan Palestina dan yang tersisa adalah hanya ingatan, hanya dikroyat. Dan yang dilakukan oleh para sastrawan Palestina adalah mencoba untuk terus menghidupkan ingatan itu. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih Zulfa. Selanjutnya next I will welcome Walid Jimlat to give your remarks.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I am delighted to be here. I didn't want to speak in Malay because people wouldn't understand me and probably would laugh a little bit. So I'll deliver this in English. And the title of my short presentation is called Because of Palestine. And except for Palestine, maybe some of you have heard that book before, Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. That was the title of the book by Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick to describe how liberals in America, prior to 2023, this book was published a few years before that, liberals in America, they were progressive on every single issue except for Palestine. So you had liberals who were promoting human rights, but when it came to Palestine, not really. Had feminists who talk about women's issues everywhere, except for Palestinian women. You had academics who opposed repression everywhere, except for Palestine. And you saw this. We had a clear experiment because just 2 years prior to 2023, the Ukrainian invasion, Russian invasion of Ukraine took place. And we saw that the world reacted, especially the Western world reacted with such force and such courage, condemning it and forcing other countries also to condemn Russia. And many people did as well. My country, Singapore, did as well. And we didn't see that same moral force when Palestine was involved, when Palestine was being decimated. And this is what I think it has done, the Palestinian issue, it has done. The latest episode in the Palestinian crisis, what it has done, a few things. The first one, it has thoroughly exposed the hypocrisy of Western powers By that I mean governments, I mean the media as well. The media has been really shameful for the most part on this. And these double standards you see, first of all, comparing Palestine to Ukraine, you see these double standards. You have Keir Starmer who said that Russia cutting off electricity, that is a war crime. When asked about Israel and Palestine, he said, we don't really know whether that's a war crime, right? And this is so stark. It's in our faces already. Another facet to this is you hear, do you condemn Hamas? Every single Muslim who comes on, not only Piers Morgan show, but many other shows, right? BBC does it as well. Do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn this, right? You never ever get a Western journalist asking, maybe Mehdi Hassan, right? To the extent that he's Western adjacent, right? You never get a journalist asking an Israeli spokesperson, do you condemn the IDF? Do you condemn this? So if you do you condemn 7 October? Okay, I do. Do you condemn 6 October? Do you condemn 8 October? Do you condemn 9? Do you condemn 7 October 2022? Do you condemn 7 October 2021? Because there has been something that has been going on there. Another facet to this hypocrisy, we hear Israel has the right to defend itself, right? And just that statement itself, if is stripped of its context, I don't think any rational person would find that unreasonable. Every country has a right to defend itself, right? If it's devoid of context. So the question is never asked, do Palestinians have the right to defend themselves? Does Palestine have the right to defend itself? And if so, how does that look like? And that's a question we should always ask, I think, politicians who say Israel has a right to defend itself. Because I can agree with that, I can get on board with that. But how does Palestinian self-defense look like? And most times, the fact that the question is asked only in one direction shows us where the double standards are. I see on your shirt, from the river to the sea, right? Palestine will be free. And as you know, from the river to the sea, that phrase has been denounced as anti-Semitic, right? That phrase, even in Singapore, that phrase is frowned upon. But in America as well, right? In America, lawmakers have said that this is anti-Semitic. Right? But in the Likud Party original charter, this is 1977, before Hamas was founded, right? A decade before Hamas was founded, says that from the river Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, there will only be Israeli sovereignty. If it's genocidal for her to say that, then it must be genocidal for Netanyahu's party as well, right? So if the title of this talk could easily be, if the shoe was on the other foot. If the shoe was on the other foot, we know that nobody would tolerate this. Right? So I think the first part is the hypocrisy and double standards. I think the moral advantage, the moral credibility of the West has completely been shattered from what has happened in the past few years. Completely been shattered. I think the world sees through it. Right? And whenever people in the West say the international community, no, the international community supports Palestine, supports a Palestinian state. The majority of nations voted for the Palestinian state, right? It's only a handful of people, right? The international community is not America and Britain and France only, right? It's the rest of the world as well. Now, so that's the first one. I think it's shattered Western moral credibility, any pretenses to it at least. The second one, I think we also have to be inward looking. I think it has thoroughly shown how ineffectual, and that this is the nicest interpretation, how ineffectual Muslim leaders, Muslim countries have been. I think this is a reality we have to contend with. It's very easy for Muslim leaders to shout slogans, to say things, but in effect, what are we doing? What are the Muslim countries doing, right? Because it can easily be stopped, I think, right? Or at least there can be a lot of things that can, okay, this is what Professor Rashid Halidi said, and I believe this as well. The battle for Palestinian liberation is not going to be won in Palestine. It's not going to be won in the Muslim countries, it's going to be one in America, right? When America turns off the tap, then Palestine will be free, right? Turn off the tap for Israel. But what are the Muslim countries doing to prod America to turn off the tap? I think that's the question. Right? And we hear our own leaders say a lot of things, but we really have to ask, to what extent is this rhetoric and to what extent is this actual commitment? How much is that actual commitment? If we really believe that 1.5, 1.6 billion Muslims with all the riches cannot do anything, then there's something wrong. And then maybe the other argument is, oh, but maybe the Muslim countries, a lot of them have their own problems and they have to settle their domestic problems. Which also shows my point also, right? That we are ineffectual. We can't do things because we have to settle something. And I think this will forever be a stain not just on the Western world, but I think it's also a stain on the Muslim world. I think that's the reality we have to contend with. And the other thing is, this episode also shows that there are always different expectations on Muslims, right? So different expectations on Muslims, because when Hamas does whatever it does, or when Hamas did whatever it did on 7 October, it's seen as terrorism. But when the IDF kills innocent people, the word terrorism is never used, right? So terrorism, in a post-9/11 world, and actually before that as well, it's almost exclusively reserved for Muslims, right? So when something happens in America, right, it's very easy for me to know whether it was a Muslim perpetrator or not, right? You know, when Charlie Kirk was shot, right? And the media reports didn't say terrorism. I saw this one white man who shot him, right? If it was a Muslim man, confirm you'll hear terrorism, extremism, then they'll call his ustads, you know, and then they'll call the neighbor, oh yeah, this guy's always already. It's always the religion that is in focus. But when it's not Muslims, it's not the religion. Right? The religion is incidental. And I think since 9/11, Muslims we have been socialized, we have been routinized into this, that whenever something happens in Afghanistan or what, then Muslims, the rest of the world, oh, Islam doesn't condone this, Islam condemns this, right? We have been routinized into that, and we do it. But I also wonder, like, how many times we have to do it, right? That by the 20th time, do I really need to distance myself from these people who didn't ask me for permission before they did whatever they did? But okay, we do it. But is there reciprocity? Is there reciprocity during this incident, right? So soon after 7 October, the Mufti of Singapore wrote a letter to the Chief Rabbi of Singapore. Basically, it's a letter of solidarity, right? And I always wonder, why is the burden of multiracialism, multi-religiosity always on the Muslims worldwide? Always on the Muslims, right? I have to ask, 2 years on, 100,000 deaths later, or whatever number it is, depending on what numbers you use. Where is my letter? Where is the reciprocity from other faiths, from other religions, right? And I think I am entitled to ask that question. Okay, so all of those are the bad news, but what is the good news, right? I think firstly we have a mobilization of young and older people throughout the world, and you see that public sentiment has changed even in America. And I think I use America and say, I mean, public sentiment in Indonesia and Malaysia being pro-Palestine. I mean, that doesn't say anything, right? That doesn't, I mean, if it's not pro-Palestine, there's a huge problem, right? But I'm from Singapore, right? Singapore is the country in Southeast Asia which is most linked to Israel. It has a special relationship with Israel. Israel helped us with our military when we were under threat from Indonesia during independence, right? And we have developed that relationship. But even in Singapore, where the default prior to 2023, the default stance of a Singaporean is to be pro-Israel. Even in Singapore, you see that changing. Now, I won't say that it has changed completely, but it has changed significantly. You see a lot of young people now, even older people now. You mention Israel and then they just, like, what is there to debate? Like for young people, even young Christians, what is there to debate? There is nothing to debate. Israel is in the wrong. And I'm talking about young conservative Christians. And so the mobilization is not just intergenerational, but it's multiracial and multi-religious. And Palestine, I think, post October 7 is where post-colonial theory meets reality, where you see a lot of the things that have been discussed by post-colonialists, uh, post-colonial scholars. You see them manifesting. Not what Edward Said said. In Orientalism is even truer today, right? 4 decades on, it's even truer today. And Singapore, I say, is the test case, right? For the reasons I mentioned. And my book, it's not a global bestseller like Anthony's, right? But it did get on Singapore's bestseller list for 27 weeks, and I don't think it deserved to be there for 27 weeks, right? I read Anthony's book. If you to ask me whose book you should buy his, not mine, right? But but the fact that it got on the bestseller list for 27 weeks is a sign that things have changed. It's a sign that people have reacted to it. People want to buy the book, right? So I think Singapore, if things have changed in Singapore and things are changing in America, I think the good news is I think Israel is cooked. It's a matter of time, right? It's a matter of time before the whole world sees this entire thing for what it is. Right? And Palestine, I guess, is the window through which a lot of people were interested in politics. Palestine is the window through which people started to question power structures, especially in international relations. Like something just, why do 5 countries still have veto power on the United Nations? There's a structural issue, like 5 countries after World War II, and they say it's World War II, the winners of World War. What war did France ever win, right? Why are they one of the 5, right? So it's a colonial inheritance that I think this world, we have inherited a lot of colonial structures without us realizing it, and Palestine, I think, has become the window through which we challenge this the most, right? So hopefully, except for Palestine, becomes because of Palestine, we see these injustices in the international system. Because of Palestine, we are able to build multiracial, multi-generational, multi-religious coalitions on an issue that we have never ever been able to do on any other issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walid. And now we welcome Anthony. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody. Look, it's wonderful to be here. I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. It's a really unique opportunity, and what I'm going to talk about is a little bit different to the first 2 speakers. I wanted to talk a little bit about why and how Palestine, as someone who is, such as myself, I am Jewish, I'm also atheist, I'm German, and I'm Australian. That all might sound confusing, but let me briefly explain what being a Jewish atheist means. It might be strange in Indonesia to hear that, but I'm obviously born Jewish. I'm not religious, but I'm culturally Jewish. And that's not that uncommon for a lot of people to call themselves that in Western countries. And in fact, I meet many people in Australia who call themselves atheist Muslims. That might sound strange here, but I know a lot of Muslim friends of mine who call themselves that. They're not religious, but they have a cultural affinity with Islam. Anyway, putting that issue aside. The reason I mention that, though, is to really talk about the perception, I know in Indonesia and many Western countries, around the connection between the Jewish community and Israel. Now, there's no doubt that many Jewish people support Israel. That's hardly a secret. Has been the case for a long time. When I was growing up in Melbourne, Australia, it was very normal for me to be told that Israel was something we needed to support. What was the reason? The reason we were given was much of my family were killed in the Holocaust, and therefore Israel was seen as a so-called safe haven. That's the argument. And for those who don't know, as a Jew, if I go to Israel tomorrow, within a few months, I can become a citizen. I am not a citizen, just to be very clear. But I could theoretically become a citizen, although it's not a very useful passport, and I wouldn't for moral reasons and political reasons, which I've said for a number of years. But the reason I wanted to say that was just to talk about how there is a growing shift in the Jewish diaspora towards this question. And although it's perceived in much of the world that and I know this because I do events all over the world, because I speak to many, particularly in the Muslim community, that there is a perception that, well, if you're Jewish, by definition, therefore you support everything Israel does. And it's not surprising that people often have that view, considering the voices often we see in our media in the West that are supporting Israel from the Jewish community are largely in lockstep with what the Israeli government are doing, supporting everything that's been happening in Gaza for the last 2 years and beyond that. And the fact is that is changing. It's not for a second to suggest that there's not still vast numbers of the Jewish community, shamefully, outrageously, that support what is happening in Palestine, but growing numbers do not. And as someone who, for the last 25 years, has been a journalist not just on the question of Palestine, but I've spent time reporting on Palestine in Gaza and the West Bank. I lived in East Jerusalem in Palestine between 2016 and 2020. That was the basis for my book, The Palestine Laboratory, which I'll get to in a minute. I take some degree of comfort from what I call a civil war going on within the Jewish community, and a growing split between the so-called mainstream Jewish voices that are 110% behind Israel, that will support anything Netanyahu does, a profound, in my view, moral failing. And as I've been saying, and I wrote a piece just this week for Middle East Eye, the UK outlet that I write a column for, saying there is a desperate need for a Jewish reckoning over what has been done, essentially in our name. There are only, we talked a minute ago about how many Muslims there are in the world. A lot. There are not that many Jews. There's about 16 or 17 million. Small, roughly half in America, half in Israel, and then the rest scattered around the world. And in the US, for example, where it's obviously the very large Jewish community, influential, there was a Washington Post poll a few months ago which found that amongst American Jews, it's more young Jews, but older Jews too, close to half believe Israel was committing war crimes, and about a third thought that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza, which is both true. Those figures would not have been conceivable 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And the civil war that I am talking about in the Jewish community in many Western countries, to which I am proud to be a part. And to be clear, when I talk about civil war, it's a non-violent civil war. It's a furious argument and debate and confrontation, is in general an older, more established Jewish community that believes that Israel must be supported, who have a belief that regardless of the endless occupation and the torture and the rape and the endless horrors in Palestine, it's our responsibility to support Israel, whereas growing numbers of us say the opposite. It is more unsafe to be a Jew in Israel than any other place on the planet, which says all you need to know about the utterly negative effects of what Israel has done for the Jewish world. There is anti-Semitism. It's real. It exists. It's a problem. It's growing. Real visceral hatred of Jews for 1,000 reasons. It's been going on for thousands of years, and it's going to continue for thousands of years. But we can't, in my view, as humans and Jews and citizens, separate what Israel is doing from that growth in anti-Semitism. What I mean by that is, it doesn't justify attacking a Jewish person. Of course it doesn't. But the idea that the majority of people on this planet are seeing and hearing what is happening in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Syria and Lebanon and beyond, and seeing mainstream Jewish voices supporting that, backing that, defending that, saying we have no choice, all Palestinians are terrorists, whatever the argument is, it's all nonsense, but that's the argument that's made. We can't be surprised that many people therefore say, well, I don't like Jews. Why would I? This is what Jews are supporting. And I'm not here to say, hey, there are other Jews who don't share this view, although I am saying that. What I'm saying is that the conversation in many countries is rightly shifting, as it should. And that in some ways leads me to why I've done some of the work that I've done. I don't wake up every day and say, right, my job is to defend Jews. Not at all. I'm often ashamed. In fact, daily I'm ashamed of what is being done in my name, and I'm ashamed of the spokespeople that are speaking for me, whether they're in Israel or Australia or the US or elsewhere, that are backing the most horrifically violent crimes in Palestine. And when I started writing about Israel-Palestine over 20 years ago, I visited Palestine for the first time in 2005. I spent most of the time in the West Bank. It was for my first book, which came out called My Israel Question, which was a critical look at the conflict and challenging the power and the negative impact of a so-called pro-Israel lobby, which tries to censor and silence critical views, including my own, which failed. But I remember a year before my book came out, just to give you a sense of how this works. In Australia, the book had been announced. They hadn't written it. It's important for you to know that. There were calls in our parliament for it to be banned. I hadn't written the book. I mean, it was nuts, and suffice to say that helped it become a bestseller. So thank you for those idiots who said that in Parliament, who have now left Parliament, thankfully, who now have a career speaking on Murdoch Sky News, but that's a separate conversation. But my point in saying that was that there is a real shift in, I think, how you see and hear. I can't speak for Indonesia, but in many Western countries, that the Jewish voices that you are hearing, particularly 18 to 35, is changing and has changed. Doesn't mean that you don't find an 18-year-old who wants to go and join the IDF. Of course you do. Sadly, tragically, outrageously. And in fact, just as an example, about 2 months ago, there were the main Jewish holidays, the Jewish New Year and Day of Atonement. And I often get sent sermons by rabbis across the world just because I'm interested in what they're saying to their congregation. And I'm obviously generalizing here, and there are many who are not like that, but it's still 2 months ago, 2 years after the genocide began, are still saying to their congregation, we need to pray for the IDF, we need to pray for Israel, we need to go and support Israel, we need to go and send our young kids to fight for Israel. For those who aren't aware, there are a lot of American Jews, Australian Jews, French Jews and others who went after October 7, who have 2 passports, an Israeli passport and an Australian passport, or American, or French, or whatever, and are fighting in Gaza. We don't know the exact number of Australians who are doing that. I have some friends of mine in the legal profession who are trying to potentially bring those people to account. I would guess it's about 50 to 100, roughly. Many more Americans, of course. And so in general, you have younger Jews in many Western countries who are saying the organizations that have represented us for half a century are not fit for purpose. They can't be reformed. They can't be changed. We need to create our own organizations to speak not just on the question of Palestine. I mean, Palestine is always a litmus test, but it's other questions. Multiculturalism, relationship with other religions, discussion with Muslims, Christians, whatever it may be. Anti-Semitism, racism that impacts one group impacts all of us. I mean, it doesn't, because a Muslim is attacked, might not be me personally or physically, but it certainly impacts all of us in the sort of societies that we want to live in. And clearly, in many Western countries, attacks against Muslims is increasing. There's no doubt about that, both in a media sense, but also in a physical sense. So when I was living in Palestine in 2016 to 20, I started doing some research that what became the Palestine Laboratory, essentially, which, just for those who don't know, a brief summary. The book looks into how Israel has used the Palestinians and the occupied Palestinian territories as a testing ground for new weapons and surveillance technology for decades and decades. Long before October 7, long before 9/11, for pretty much since Israel began. It's in 1948. And that's been turbocharged after 9/11 and even more so after October 7, where the Israeli arms industry is booming. It's worth about $15 billion US a year. It's selling to huge amounts of countries around the world, including here. Indonesia has dealt with Israel in the past. They have no official relations. I note that your president seems to be flirting with the possibility of recognizing Israel, which seems, after 2 years of genocide, an insane and offensive thing to do, in my personal opinion. I don't vote here, but that's just my personal view. And So the book in some ways is a global investigation into what the laboratory means, both for Palestinians but also for many citizens globally, because what happens in Palestine doesn't stay there and it's being exported. So I say and document, we don't even know the exact number, but 130, 140 countries on the planet, so the majority, have bought some form of Israeli spyware or weapon or drone that's been tested first on Palestinians. Long before October 7, but certainly also since October 7, where a lot of global arms fairs that go on, these Israeli companies are there amongst other nations, and often you have videos that these Israeli defense companies are showing. Sometimes they're available on YouTube, which actually show Palestinian civilians being killed, murdered by an Israeli drone or an Israeli weapon. And that is seen as something that other nations want to follow. And one of the challenges, and I'll finish with this, one of the challenges that many of us have that talk about this issue, I agree with Walid when he says, correctly, that the global uprising around this issue in the last 2 years has been unprecedented. I mean, there's no doubt in country after country there's been millions of people, including in the US. The challenge is taking that into political action. And yes, I think you could argue that the recent election in New York for Zoran Mamdani, who's now going to be the mayor starting in January, I think it's inconceivable that someone like him, a young Muslim man whose whole platform was not about Palestine, but it certainly wasn't ignoring Palestine, he would have had no chance in hell, in my view, in winning that 3, 5, 10 years ago. And about a third of New York Jews voted for him. Obviously, a majority of New Yorkers also voted for him, clearly. And he didn't back down from being anti-Zionist. He didn't back down. Now, what that practically means when he comes into office, we'll have to wait and see. But what I'm saying is by that example, or for example, the support in the UK of a man called Zach Polanski, who's a leader of the Greens Party. His support is surging. He's Jewish. He's anti-Zionist. He's pro-Palestine. There are example after example of people who are realizing that the public anger and outcry in the last 2 years across the globe can translate into political power, whatever that might look like. And even nations that publicly opposed what Israel has been doing in the last 2 years often secretly admire it. And I want to finish on this point. It's not for me to comment on how the Muslim world has reacted. I would say, leadership-wise, I'm talking about, pretty badly. Not controversial to say that, pretty true. And it's worth saying that virtually every main Muslim country in the last 2 years has in fact wanted to deepen ties with Israel. Virtually every main Arab nation, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the list goes on, who have had and have relations with Israel, have deepened their military ties with Israel. They are buying more equipment and more surveillance tech because they fear their own people. And what that says to you is, well, it says a lot of things, doesn't it? Firstly, it says, I think for a long time, Arab elites, and I'm generalizing, but I think it's pretty fair, have hated Palestinians. Hate Palestinians, hate what they stand for, hate the fact that it gets in their way of close ties with Israel. And it's why, amongst other reasons, that many, many people in the Arab world loathe their leaders. And what do they need to protect themselves, the leaders? Israeli surveillance tech. This is an ongoing loop. So the challenge we have is to take the political power that we've seen on the streets in country after country and putting that into actual tangible action. And I think it's possible, but it's not going to be easy. Thank you.
Stay here, Azul. Okay, I'm inviting Walid and Zulfa. Before we proceed to the question and answers with the audience, I'm going to exercise my right as a moderator to actually give some question. First for Zulfa. Zulfa tadi ketika Zulfa bicara soal Adenia Shibli, Ghassan Kanafani.
I want to understand what she's saying. So my Bahasa is not that good.
Okay, so for Anthony, I'm going to repeat my question. Okay, ketika tadi Zulfa bicara soal adanya Shibli, Ghazan Kanafani, kita kan ngomong bahwa sastra Palestina itu membuat uh, penderitaan warga Palestina itu bukan hanya sebagai statistik, ya. Jadi mereka itu bukan apa ya angka gitu ya, tapi mereka adalah subjek yang merasakan dan saya kira itu sebuah pemaparan yang sangat baik. Yang ingin saya tanyakan adalah responsnya dunia internasional selama ini terhadap apa ya humanizing functionnya itu kepada solidaritas internasional sementara ini bagaimana Mbak Zulfa, dan bedanya ketika cuma dengan retorika politik apa bedanya? Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Mbak Nina untuk pertanyaannya. Saya pernah menonton sebuah film dokumenter di Netflix, tapi saya lupa judulnya apa. Tapi saya ingat ketika kameramen itu menyorot seorang ibu-ibu Palestina, kemudian ibu-ibu itu marah dan berkata, dunia mau melihat apa lagi? Kata-kata dunia mau melihat apa lagi itu terus membayangi saya, dan benar, dunia mau melihat apa lagi dari Palestina? Gambar-gambar, foto-foto, video-video dari Gaza, dari tepi barat kurang mengerikan apa? Jadi, dan menurut saya itu semua karena narasi politik ataupun narasi berita yang memposisikan apa ya, Palestina itu sebatas tadi angka, dan juga sebatas objek yang menerima ketidakadilan dan patut dikasihani gitu. Padahal menurut saya Palestina itu butuh sesuatu yang lebih dari sekedar simpati. Karena kalau simpati itu cuma melahirkan rasa kasihan. Dan saya jujur aja ini mungkin agak frontal ya. Saya kurang suka gitu dengan konten-konten ketika menjadikan Palestina itu seperti konten vibes-nya itu peduli kasih gitu. Karena ketidakadilan yang terjadi sama Palestina itu bukan seperti bencana alam. Kayak oke, takdir Tuhan, bismillahirrahmanirrahim, astagfirullah, dan lain sebagainya. Responnya seperti itu. Sabar dan lain sebagainya. Tidak. Ketidakadilan yang terjadi, yang menimpa rakyat Palestina, itu adalah ketidakadilan yang bisa dicegah. Keadilan yang dilakukan oleh tangan manusia gitu. Jadi kita butuh sesuatu yang lebih dari sekedar simpati. Dan menurut saya sastra bisa melakukan itu. Karena sastra itu mengajak kita untuk masuk ke karakter dari tokoh itu. Jadi kita melihat dengan matanya, kita mendengar dengan telinganya, kita bisa tahu gejolak yang terjadi di dalam pikiran dan juga emosinya. Dan itu akhirnya menciptakan sesuatu yang atau melahirkan sesuatu yang lebih besar dari simpati, yaitu empati. Jadi kita bisa merasakan gitu, oh gitu yang dialami. Dan saya membayangkan kalau saya jadi ibu-ibu Palestina, saya juga akan marah. Ngapain kamu terus menyorot aku, terus menjadikan aku sebagai objek yang dikasihani? Aku nggak perlu dikasihani. Yang diperlukan oleh rakyat Palestina itu bukan belas kasihan. Yang diperlukan oleh mereka adalah kita membantu mereka menghentikan sistem yang membuat kehidupan mereka itu menderita. Seperti itu. Jadi itu semua sepertinya bisa kita lakukan melalui sastra.
Jadi silakan tekan. Jangan sabar, ayo marah gitu ya. Jangan sabar mulu gitu. Baik. Next for Walid, my question is, you grew up in a very political family. For those of you who don't know, I try to Google Walid's name to follow him on Instagram, and Google keep recommending me the real Walid, but the old Lebanese politician. And your brother's name is Yasser Arafat. Okay, that's an illustration of how political his family is. My question is, as someone who grew up in a really political family, how do you actually see this collective anguish that we have right now? You know, how do we translate it into sustained political action? You know, that transcend even religious identity.
Thank you so much. So before I answer your question, I just wanted to jump on Anthony's comment just now about how Muslim countries have been more than complicit, but we are also in the largest Muslim country in the world. I think there's a lot of responsibility on Indonesia's shoulders. Sometimes we give Indonesia a pass, right?
Sometimes. Emphasize on sometimes.
Partly because I think Indonesia doesn't always portray itself as in that's not part of its self-identity as, you know, oh, we are the largest Muslim country as compared to Malaysia, right, which tries to be at the forefront of Muslim politics in the world. So I do think there is something that is on us, you know. And I say this, you know, as a friend, as a neighbor, as someone who wishes Indonesia well, you know. So I really think that that's something we need to think about. And I'll get to the question. And my brother's name is Yasir Arafat indeed. My cousin is Muammar Gaddafi. Um, I have I have a cousin who's Ayatollah Khomeini. Yes, um, Sheikh Hassan Nasrullah. Yeah, and all these are actual cousin names. Okay, and this is part of our identity. So we were all named by one uncle. So we were, yeah. So he named all of us, and this was, and if you know, Walid Jumla is not even Muslim, right? He's Druze, and so I was named. It was after the Arab revivalist leaders, and it's just so my honeymoon was in Palestine, because that's how I grew up with, right? So I always wanted to go because my uncle always instilled this in us, and what I saw, so from my own personal journey, to answer your question, right? I was boycotting Starbucks and McDonald's when I was 17 years old, right? This is 23 years ago. And people around me, people in my family, people in my around friends are making fun of me. Loved one, making fun of me for one person, what can you do? Oh, then, and then they'll do this stupid thing, right? Oh, if you boycott McDonald's, then you have to boycott all the, if you don't boycott the 998 things, you cannot boycott 2 things, right? Those kinds of arguments, right? But that's a completely shifted. That has completely shifted now. People who eat McDonald's, right? They are the ones, the people who criticize me, they are the ones who will go after them, right? So I've just seen this in my own personal life, right? Then the question is, how do we translate this into political action? And that's not an easy question because it's really dependent on political context. For it to be sustainable, also, you don't want to be arrested. You don't want all these things, right? In Singapore, the situation is completely different from in Indonesia, right? We are not a liberal democracy. Not that Indonesia is very liberal democracy, but it's more democratic than Singapore is. Singapore is elections, but Indonesia is more democratic than Singapore is. We cannot have, in the past, unlawful assembly was 5 people gathering. Now 1 person gathering can be illegal gathering. True, this is true. In Singapore, this is the case. So you know these are the things. So what can you do, right? So, and Singaporeans have come up with very creative things. The socks I'm wearing now is if you can see the watermelon here, it's my friend who made this, a Chinese person. She made this and she gave it for free. And people have all sorts of, they make all sorts of shirts and they give it out to people. I mean, I wrote a book, but you see the keffiyeh is being worn in Singapore quite often. If you go to Singapore, you'll see it quite, I won't say like every day, but if you go to Arab Street every day you'll see that, right? In the heart of Singapore, in Bugis, you'll see it every day. So you resist in the ways that would make it sustainable. Now, of course, there are people who are more radical than I am, and they don't mind being arrested and so on, but I am not that brave, so I still want I try to flirt with the boundaries, right? But there are I think each society has to decide what, and the leaders of that society, I don't mean political leaders, I mean the intellectual leaders, I mean civil society, I mean the artists, right, have to decide that, for me, this is the biggest moral crisis of our generation. So we have to decide what we want to do with it. Because I mentioned this to, because I'm the advisor to NTU Muslim Society. And I mentioned this to them. 10 years from now, when you're an adult, you're going to realize that, hey, I was the president of Muslim Society when a genocide was going on. What did I do? What did I do? And I think every society has to decide based on the political conditions and the context of that country.
Thank you, Walid. Anthony, you grew up in Melbourne, right? I just spent 4 years in Melbourne for my doctoral study, and I could testify that there were a lot of awkward moments for us every time we talk about Palestine, right? So there's a weekly demonstration in front of the State Hall, State Library, correct? But every time we talk about Palestine in the uni, there was always, some awkward whisper like, you have to be neutral about it. There's more complicated matters, especially if you are international students, right? There are a lot of, things that can be challenged if you're. So my question is, how do you see Jewish identity being reshaped by confronting Israel's actions in Palestine for Jews.
I mean, firstly, just on Australia briefly, and I live in Sydney. Australia is
Mhm.
has a bit of a schizophrenic relationship with this question, and what I mean by that is that in some ways, countries that are economically secure. I'm not for a second minimizing growing people's struggles to pay for bills and food at all. I'm not minimizing that. But in general, Australia is a relatively wealthy country compared to many others. And I think that can limit for some people their desire to be too political. And you see this in many countries. I mean, not that, as I said, there's lots of examples of protest movements in the US and UK and the Western nations for a range of reasons. But in general, having said that, what you've seen in relation to Palestine in the last 2 years in Australia is some of the biggest protests we've seen for decades. There was a massive protest some of you will have seen on the Harbour Bridge in Sydney, which I was there, along with about 350,000 other people, which is pretty huge. The city's only got 5 million people. It's massive. Australia also, for those who don't know, is, and I've done a lot of reporting on this, is sending weapons parts for the F-35 fighter jet that Israel is using over Gaza. Indeed. I mean, Australia, our Prime Minister lies about it, our Foreign Minister Penny Wong lies about it. I mean, they literally get asked and they say we don't do it. It's just a lie. They're lying, openly lying. So that's bad, to put it mildly. What you see in Australia, though, there's about 120,000 Jews, roughly, in Sydney and Melbourne. Pretty conservative community, pretty supportive of Israel in general, but that is changing, particularly with younger Jews. And that's mirroring what's happening overseas. And the dissatisfaction or even contempt that I was talking about before that many younger Jews have towards the institutions that supposedly support them, whether it's synagogues or community organizations, has led them, and I'm involved with one particularly, the Jewish Council of Australia, to form your own organization. Like those other organizations are not reformable. It's done. They are set in their ways. They'll support Israel till the cows come home. That's it. And that to me is a sign of strength. Hello? Yes. That to me is a sign of strength, that there is a growing diversity of opinion, whereas many in the Jewish establishment are petrified of that dissent. I mean, you can't commit genocide for 2 years and be shocked that some people, Jew or otherwise, think this is not okay. And that moral Jewish reckoning that I talked about before, as I think needs to happen in every Jewish country. On one level, it's a conversation with the wider community. On the other hand, it's a conversation that has to happen within the Jewish community. It can be done publicly, but it's necessary. I mean, this is a community which has largely supported what Israel is doing. It's totally unacceptable.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony. Which remind me, maybe about weeks after that, anti supporting Palestine protest, there's an anti-immigration protest in Melbourne, which is, kind of illustrate the nuances that we have in Australia. Oke, saya akan lempar pertanyaan untuk teman-teman semua. Pertanyaan bisa dalam bahasa Indonesia dan bahasa Inggris, karena kita ada penerjemahan di sini. Silakan, tolong sebutkan namanya dan pertanyaannya.
Hello, my name is Ardi, and my question is for Mr. Wali Jumad. Maybe similar to the moderator's question, I also want to ask about your experience growing up as a Muslim Singaporean. Because I think in Indonesia, as someone who's growing up Muslim, we often being taught that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is like a religious war between Islam and also Jews. Yeah, when you're attending sermon, usually they always talk like that. But I think little by little, we are opening our eyes that it's about Zionism against the Palestinian, whatever their religion, right? And what's about your experience growing up in Singapore? Thank you.
Hello. So my name is Gabriel. I think I'd like to hear opinions from every panelist. So there is a president who uses two-state solutions as a moral argument to justify opening diplomatic relations with Israel and with countries affiliated with Israel. So is this something that can be considered acceptable in international politics? especially for developing countries like Indonesia.
Yeah.
That's my question.
Thank you, Gabriel. One
Thank you so
more for
much.
the first session. Yeah.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi
Mohon
wabarakatuh.
maaf saya menggunakan bahasa Indonesia.
Nggak
Iya
apa-apa,
ya.
Mbak. Nggak usah minta maaf. silakan.
Gini Mbak, saya mau minta pendapat dari panelis yang ada di depan.
Mm-mm.
Jadi gini, kalau ketika kita bicara, saya aja deh ya,
Mm-mm.
saya sebagai warga negara Indonesia, sebagai dari perspektif agama, saya sebagai Muslim, di dalam ayat suci Al-Quran, itu insya Allah di surat Al-Hasyr, kalau saya tidak lupa ya, atau surat Al-Anfal, bahwasanya ketika ada sesama kaum muslimin dan muslimat kita yang berseteru, maka bila memungkinkan didamaikan. Nah, itu menurut perspektif agama ya. Tapi ketika kita bicara internasional politiknya, Netanyahu saat di forum PBB, kalau nggak salah di bulan September, itu dia membuat statement di depan forum bahwasanya dari pihak Palestina sendiri, mohon maaf, saya tidak tahu kebenarannya ya, tapi dia membuat statement bahwasanya bayi dibakar di depan orang tuanya, warga Israel gitu ya. Jadi bagaimana menurut kalian? Kalau saya jujur sebagai warga negara Indonesia, kalau bisa mendamaikan, jadi tidak ada keberpihakan. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Dengan ke siapa, maaf? Asrin ya. Jadi pertanyaannya apakah perdamaian itu mungkin gitu ya? Bagaimana opini dari panelis? Iya, iya. Iya, baik. I'll let Walid answer the first question first. Your experience as growing up as a Muslim Singaporean, please.
Okay. So it is true. I think that even in Singapore, even until now, there is a tendency. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a protest by Singaporeans because there was a group that wanted to raise funds for. They wanted to have an event called Alia. Alia about return to. This is a pro-Israel group. Wanted to do it at one of the hotels, and the protest was led by a non-Muslim. It was online, and then it was cancelled. And then somehow, so it was a civil issue, right? A non-Muslim who led that, but somehow the narrative became, oh, the Christians were about to push back against the Muslims. So even this is just a few weeks ago. So even until now, the narrative is not just Muslims and Jews, because the evangelical Christians who believe in Israel's existence, right, as necessary, based, I think, on a mistranslation. But anyway, so that's for Christians to decide and discuss among themselves, right? The issue, I think, is the Palestinian conflict is not at its core religious; it's political. Because, and as you know, there are many Palestinian Christians as well in the West Bank. You know, even in Gaza, the Catholic Church was bombed. But we also cannot pretend that it's not. I mean, the fact that Anthony is here, it shows that it's not religious entirely, right? I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, there are OG Jews who opposed it, right? Norman Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky. But now you have so many. Dave Smith, so many Jews around the world who are opposing Israel. But we also cannot pretend that there are no religious connotations, right? I think Muslims are the ones who always say, oh, this is not a religious issue. But then most of the protests you see Muslims, right? I think we just embrace our Muslim identity and say, yeah, I care about this because I am a Muslim. But I give you the assurance, if it was the Muslims who were the perpetrators, I would have the same amount of fervor as well, right? And unfortunately for us, there are many Muslim perpetrators of that nature as well. Now in Sudan, even in Yemen, right? So if I could briefly just answer the other, just my own brief thoughts on the other two, is that
cool.
okay? Yeah. So the two-state solution and that as an excuse, right? The Singaporean perspective is Singapore managed to conduct airdrops into Gaza, food airdrops, and the only reason why Singapore could do that because we have diplomatic ties with Israel and we have a relationship with Israel. So there is some benefit to. I'm not saying that suddenly countries which do not have relationships with Israel should do that. I don't think so. I think if you want to have that it must never be unconditional. If you are referring to your president, it should be a conditional thing. Recognize, give the Palestinian state first, and then we normalize, not before. I don't understand when Muslim countries did that, right? We normalize first, and then it's never gonna happen, right? And which brings me to the last question. Itu adalah satu pembohongan. Tidak pernah terjadi, bayi terbakar. Tidak pernah. Itu pembohongan dari hari pertama. Tetapi kerana ia repeated over and over again, this was told over and over again. Western media, people like Piers Morgan, BBC, all picked it up and said the 40 babies, right? Netanyahu, Donald Trump, of course, Joe Biden as well. Netanyahu, 1 month or a few weeks before 7 October, he went to the United Nations General Assembly, this 2023, he took out a map of the Middle East with no Palestine inside. With no Palestine. Tadi ayat Quran yang diberikan itu antara dua kelompok Muslim yang berperang. Tetapi memang kalau bukan Muslim pun berperang, kalau kita boleh berdamai, kita akan berdamai. Tetapi masalahnya, ini ada satu pihak yang tidak mahu kedamaian. Mereka tidak mahu. Dan dia sudah kata dia tidak mahu kedamaian. Apa lagi yang kita perlu fikir? Kan? Dia, when Maya Angelou said, when somebody tells you who they are, believe them the first time, right? I believe Netanyahu long ago, right? So we don't need to pretend that he is somebody he's not.
Thank you, Walid. Selanjutnya, saya mau mengundang Kak Zulfa untuk menjawab ya. So, mungkin Kak Zulfa bisa jawab 2 pertanyaan langsung ya. Yang pertama tadi, pendapat two-state solutions itu bagaimana gitu ya. Yang kedua adalah tadi, persoalan tentang anjuran ayat Al-Quran kita untuk mendamaikan pihak yang berseteru, apakah dalam hal ini mungkin? Silakan.
Saya akan menjawab untuk pertanyaan yang tadi yang solusi 2 negara itu. Solusi 2 negara adalah solusi yang sudah basi, solusi yang sudah basi kalau sebagaimana yang dikatakan oleh Atif Abu Saif itu adalah al-hilul mafqud. Solusi yang udah hilang, nggak bisa diharapkan lagi. Dan sebenarnya itu adalah jawaban template yang dilakukan oleh negara-negara di dunia untuk menyelamatkan muka saja, biar dikira manusiawi karena oke, aku membela Palestina, tapi di satu sisi juga tidak mau repot untuk membela Palestina, untuk mendukung mereka agar negara mereka itu bebas gitu. Jadi ya itu adalah template yang sudah basi. Kalau dengar itu ya bilang gitu aja.
Ya. Kalau yang tentang perdamaian tadi.
Ya, dan juga solusi 2 negara menjadi masalah karena di dalam solusi itu seperti hanya yang saya karena membaca beberapa artikelnya Edward Said yang bicara tentang perjanjian Oslo misalnya, yang juga mengangkat solusi 2 negara. Dalam solusi itu tidak dibahas tentang hak pengungsi Palestina untuk kembali ke negara mereka. Padahal rakyat Palestina itu ada 6 juta, 4 jutanya itu tersebar di seluruh dunia. Dan mereka itu menanti untuk kembali ke tanah air. Jadi no to solution. Dan sekarang saya juga sepertinya mungkin nanti juga bisa mungkin Wali juga tahu dan juga Anthony. Sekarang orang-orang udah mulai berani untuk menyatakan solusi 1 negara, gitu. Bukan 2 negara lagi. Walaupun 1 negara ini tidak tahu ya bagaimana wujudnya gitu. Karena memang sudah saking basinya itu solusi 2 negara, gitu.
Terima kasih.
Yang satu lagi ya. Kalau tidak salah paham adalah apakah kita bisa netral gitu ya?
Damai.
Bisa damai gitu.
Perdamaian.
Tadi seperti yang sudah disinggung juga sama Walid, memang Israel tidak mau damai. Apa buktinya? Dia terus melakukan aneksasi di tepi barat. Jadi itu adalah sebuah bukti kalau dia tidak mau berdamai. Itu juga yang dibicarakan oleh Ilan Pape dalam bukunya dan juga Noam Chomsky dalam bukunya On Palestine. Sejak awal Israel itu tidak mau berdamai. Jadi sejak awal Israel itu mengulur-ngulur waktu dengan gencatan senjata, mengulur waktu dengan rapat-rapat di PBB dan lain sebagainya yang kemudian terus di veto. Jadi ya kita tidak bisa mengharapkan ya perdamaian dari Israel seperti ini. Dan saya juga teringat perkataan siapa ya kalau nggak salah seorang jurnalis dari Israel di Haaretz, Gideon Levin kalau nggak salah, ya dia mengatakan kalau mau perubahan tidak bisa kita harapkan dari masyarakat Israel, karena masyarakat Israel itu sudah terkontaminasi pemikirannya. Yang kalau mau perubahan itu bisa kita harapkan justru dari luar Israel dan mungkin bisa diawali dari kita semua. Terima kasih.
Ya, dan menambahkan sebetulnya kalau two state solutions keluar dari Indonesia itu agak aneh ya, karena kayak Walid tulis bahwa pertama kali hak Palestina itu direcognize secara internasional ya di konferensi Bandung, di konferensi Asia Afrika gitu ya. Terus kenapa sekarang kita mundurnya berapa langkah gitu ya. Oke, Anthony, two state solution?
No. No, I've got a few other things to say though. Briefly, very brief. I mean, I think in many ways the conflict, the war, whatever you want to call Israel and Palestine, is not principally about religion, is about land and yes, Zionism. However, and it's an important however, there's no doubt that what's happened in the last half a century, thanks to Israeli and Western support, is a explosion of what can only be called a cancer, which is a religious Jewish fundamentalism amongst the settler population, who now number across the West Bank around 800,000. They're not all fanatics, but a sizable number are. Their vision for the future is like the Taliban. That is their vision. That's what they want. Obviously, Jewish, not Muslim, of course, but a fundamentalist future. Now, that's not all Israeli Jews, but I agree what you just said about having spent a lot of time in Israel as well. Like what happened with apartheid South Africa, the end of that. It wasn't because white South Africans woke up one morning and said this apartheid's awful. There were some who fought against it very bravely, and I commend them, of course. I know some of them. But the vast majority of white South Africans were fine with apartheid. It was totally fine for them. They didn't have a problem with it practically or morally. And Israeli Jews are the same. The polling amongst Israeli Jews before October 7, but certainly since, and I don't think this gets nearly enough attention in the West, and maybe even in Indonesia, is truly genocidal. A majority of Israelis 6 months ago supported starving Palestinians. A majority of Israeli Jews supported ethnically cleansing Palestinians. This is not Netanyahu. The problem in Israel is not Netanyahu. I mean, he is awful and should be in The Hague. There's no defense of poor Netanyahu, I can assure you. But the problem is not him. The problem is the society itself, which has been, I mean, there's different words to talk about it, brainwashing. And when you have Western impunity for 80 odd years, why would you change?
Thank you. Kita masuk sesi kedua, masih ada waktu. Tadi kita mulainya agak mundur, jadi ya silakan. 1, 2. Panitia mungkin atau Walid.
Hope they're paying him well for this. Yeah. I mean, this is you're doing a very good job.
I like having an active panelist like this. Thank you, Walid.
All the way from Singapore, you're doing a great job.
Silakan nama dan pertanyaannya.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Saya Dika. Saya mengutip banyak media yang isu Palestina adalah, tapi kalau saya coba menambahkan, Zionisme adalah kamus besar kriminal. Dia adalah manifesto kejahatan yang paling keji di sejarah peradaban dunia. Kejahatan apapun yang ada di dunia, rujukannya adalah Zionisme. Pertanyaan saya kepada Mbak Zulfa, kebetulan saya senang dengan sastra Arab dan saya banyak membaca karya-karya Mbak Zulfa, karya terjemahannya dalam detail kecil dan beberapa sastra-sastra Arab lainnya yang diterbitkan oleh penerbit Bentang. Menarik di Islam itu kan, khususnya sastra Arab Islam di Arab kan bukan cuma Islam ya, ada juga Kristen ya, di Lebanon seperti Kristen Maronit. Itu kan menarik Mbak. Sastra-sastra Arab itu banyak berpandangan filosofis, mistisisme. Itu yang kerap yang saya alami gitu, yang saya pengalaman membaca sastra Arab itu, kalau bukan mistisisme yang kemudian filsafat gitu, yang irfani. Namun Palestina ini menjadi menarik gitu. Tadi Mbak Zulfa tengahkan bahwa sastra Arab Palestina itu menarik karena dia punya ciri khas khusus adalah Al-Arabiyah Al-Mukawamah ya kalau nggak salah ya. Ya, sastra Arab yang melawan gitu. Nah, sejak kapan ini lahir sastra Arab perlawanan ini? Apakah bagaimana dengan sebelum adanya Zionisme? Apakah sastra Arab Palestina itu melawan atau dia sama seperti halnya sastra Arab pada umumnya yang berbunga-bunga, yang penuh metafora, yang kebanyakan berdialog dengan Tuhan, kalau enggak ada yang profetik gitu dan lain sebagainya macam. Itu yang saya pertanyakan. Kemudian yang kedua, saya pikir sastra Arab ini saya pikir ada nggak ulama gitu memberikan fatwa gitu. Saya nggak tahu ya, ini mungkin terlalu ceroboh saya kalau katakan memberikan fatwa. Atau adakah majelis sastra Arab kemudian memberikan instruksi bahwa sastra kita itu harus melawan gitu, bukan lagi penuh dengan metaforik, karena keadaan yang menurut saya kolonialisme ini nggak bisa lagi kita netral gitu, apalagi kita diam gitu, karena saya pikir di Mekah ya sastra-sastra Arab atau pendidikan bahasa itu banyak disensor ya Mbak, kalau mengulas tentang Palestina kalau nggak salah ya, seperti itu.
Ya,
mungkin itu saja. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih ya. Ada 2 pertanyaan berarti. Satu lagi tadi dari sebelah sana.
Halo, selamat sore menjelang malam semua. Nama saya Andi. Pertanyaan saya ada 2 juga. Yang pertama untuk Mbak Zulfa. Saya membayangkan Mbak Zulfa sering membaca sastra Arab termasuk Palestina, kemudian menyelami alam pikir ya senior-senior kita ya, generasi yang mungkin mereka lebih dekat ke Nakbah, ya kan? Nah, saya pengen tahu kalau untuk generasi yang sekarang, gimana Mbak melihat perubahan, bagaimana cara mereka mendekati atau berusaha memahami realitas mereka, dan bagaimana cara mereka mengekspresikan apa yang mereka rasakan, bagaimana perubahan itu terjadi. Karena kalau kita lihat perjuangan di Palestina itu berevolusi kan, yang dimulai dalam pemahaman saya orang-orang kiri yang mereka ada nasionalisme yang bangkit, dan orang-orang kiri ini memimpin perjuangan di Palestina dan kemudian berevolusi menjadi sebuah gerakan yang lebih religius, bahkan mungkin ultra religious kan. Dan bagaimana perjalanan itu mempengaruhi mereka sekarang di zaman digital, di mana mereka punya platform yang tentunya lebih luas lagi. Terima kasih. Itu pertanyaan saya satu. My second question is for the both of you actually. So this is concerning the sort of the mechanics of the distribution of what is being experimented in Palestine, right? What you are studying basically, Anthony. I'm hoping that you could enlighten us more about the mechanics, how that experiment trickled to the market. My background is a business journalist, right? How the sort of like the startup environment, the ecosystem kind of absorb the knowledge from unit 182 or whatever, right? And how the military, because my concern is obviously about Indonesia, how talking about countries who are hypocritical. We are one of the hypocrites, obviously, because we acquire a lot of technologies from Israel, whether that is surveillance or weapon parts, basically. And I was wondering, I'm trying to understand how that mechanics, how that invention trickle first to the private sector, and second to the to the sovereign, to the military, of course, because I think those have 2 different tracks, right? Maybe you can enlighten that. And related to this question is Singapore, the role of Singapore, right? From what I understand is, the embassy in Singapore serve as a sort of like a conduit or a hub for a country like Indonesia that does not have, direct diplomatic relationship with Israel, right? So maybe you can enlighten us on like the role of diplomats, or the role of Singapore, Singapore being the sort of like the financial hub for Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Terima kasih, Pak Andi. Satu lagi, ya, silakan Kak. Yang di belakang. Silakan, nama dan pertanyaan.
Oke, nama saya Levi. Saya ingin memberikan tanggapan dan pertanyaan bahwa memang kita semua sudah sadar dan memiliki kinship atau allyship terhadap Palestina sebagai masyarakat dan juga komunitas marginal yang mengalami genosida. Tapi aku ingin juga memberikan tanggapan bahwa mungkin di dalam konteks internasional kita masyarakat dari Global South tentu sering termarginalkan dan terpinggirkan dari narasi-narasi kolonial yang digaungkan oleh Global North. Tapi bagaimana kita dalam konteks lokal ini komplisit terhadap genosida yang terjadi dalam lokal, yaitu terhadap Papua Barat dan masyarakat-masyarakat adat yang ada di lingkungan industri smelter nikel yang ada di Morowali. Lalu bagaimana sih kita bisa membangun melatih keberpihakan yang memiliki nafas dekol sehingga kita juga memiliki keberpihakan yang tidak hanya cherry picking terhadap satu isu tapi juga interseksional dalam konteks lokal, regional atau internasional. Begitu.
Terima kasih. Tadi namanya siapa Kak? Maaf. Levi. Ya, terima kasih. Oke, mungkin pertama kita ke Mbak Zulfa dulu ya. Tadi ada 3 berarti pertanyaannya. 4 berarti karena Kak Dika ini ada 2 pertanyaannya. Pertama, Kak Zulfa, sejak kapan sastra Arab itu memiliki ciri menjadi melawan gitu ya, melawan sastra Palestina, dan tentang majelis sastra Arab itu, adakah gitu fatwa tadi katanya, instruksi gitu untuk silakan.
Terima kasih atas pertanyaannya. Terima kasih juga sudah membaca terjemahan saya. Saya ingin meluruskan sedikit bahwa sebenarnya sastra-sastra Arab itu tidak hanya tentang yang mistis, yang irfani, tapi juga kita bisa mendapatkan banyak sekali genre Arab yang tidak kalah sebenarnya dengan sastra-sastra Barat. Seperti kita bisa melihat genre realisme seperti di novel-novelnya Najib Mahfud, walaupun Najib Mahfud sebenarnya juga mengalami perkembangan ya, dia melakukan banyak eksperimen, mencobai banyak aliran dalam novel-novelnya. Kita juga bisa melihat novel yang bersifat distopia, misalnya seperti yang saya terjemahkan di Anagram, Kutukan Bocah Palestina, ataupun juga novel dari Ibu Taina Isa yang juga sudah diterjemahkan di dalam bahasa Indonesia. Kemudian juga ada realis magic juga, seperti halnya novelnya kok aku lupa ya, novel dari Irak, Frankenstein in Baghdad. Jadi saya cuma ingin mengatakan banyak sekali genre sastra dalam sastra Arab itu memiliki atau sudah mencobai banyak sekali genre-genre dalam kesastraan. Kemudian tadi pertanyaannya sejak kapan ya sastra Al-Adab Al-Muqawim itu muncul? Sebenarnya itu ada perdebatan. Ada yang mengatakan sastra ini baru muncul setelah Nakba. Ada juga yang mengatakan itu muncul sejak diadakannya revolusi pertama kali pada tahun 1936 yang meminta agar pengungsi atau agar imigrasi para imigran Yahudi ke Palestina itu dihentikan. 1936 revolusi pertama yang kemudian akhirnya menjadi bentrokan seperti itu. Tapi kalau kita melihat sebenarnya terlepas sebelum Nakba itu sudah ada kayak tadi puisi yang saya kutip Wadi Al-Bustani yang sudah mewanti-wanti tentang kedatangan para imigran, dan itu juga sudah bisa dikatakan sebagai sastra perlawanan karena dia secara tidak langsung menyinggung tentang identitas tentang Palestina gitu. Tapi memang sastra Al-Adab Al-Muqawim itu mendapatkan momentumnya di dalam tragedi Nakba seperti itu. Walaupun juga kalau mau sedikit filosofis, ada jawaban dari Adeni Sibli, ada cerita dari dia mengutip sebuah cerpen gitu ya, milik Azim kalau tidak salah, yang menceritakan tentang dia cuman tentang alarm aja gitu, menceritakan tentang keseharian seorang laki Palestina yang normal gitu. Dan menurut Adeni Sibli, cerita tentang kehidupan normal Palestina itu ada sebuah bentuk perlawanan juga. Karena itu menunjukkan bahwa oh ternyata Palestina pernah tidak dijajah ya. Oh ternyata Palestina pernah mengalami kehidupan normal seperti halnya kita, seperti itu.
Kak Zulfa, tentang generasi sekarang, tanyanya Pak Andi tadi. Gimana mereka mendekati realitas mereka? Tadi juga dikaitkan dengan kemampuan atau platform digital ya.
Oh iya. Saya mungkin mau membandingkan antara novelnya misalnya Gusar Kanapani, dia punya novel yang berjudul Aidun ila Haifa. Itu kembali ke Haifa, back to Haifa gitu. Di sana terlihat sekali bagaimana Gusar Kanapani itu ingin menyelipkan visi ideologisnya tentang keyakinan dia kalau ingin kalau cara untuk memerdekakan Palestina adalah melalui perjuangan Palestina. Dan itu terasa sekali gitu. Terus kalau kita lihat misalnya sekarang Adeni Sibli misalnya, ingin saya kutip. Adeni Sibli itu melakukan eksperimen luar biasa untuk menghadirkan bagaimana wajah Palestina itu ditampilkan dengan wajah yang berbeda. Dalam novel Detail Kecil misalnya, kalau biasanya kita itu membaca novel-novel Palestina seperti halnya Ra'aitu Ramallah, Aisyah Ramallah, habis itu ada juga Tonturiyah misalnya, biasanya Palestina itu digambarkan dengan narasi yang menangis, penuh air mata. Habis itu ada selipan tentang orasi moral, ada makian, ada kutukan. Sedangkan Adeni Sibli itu menghadirkan apa yang disebut dengan asardul barid, narasi yang dingin. Jadi kalau kita membaca karya itu, kita tidak akan mendapatkan orasi-orasi semacam itu, dan kita melihat dengan dekat, kita cuma dikasih adegan saja gitu oleh Adenia. Dan ada bagian dari yang menurut saya ini paling menyayat ya, ketika membicarakan tentang atau adegan tentang gadis Badui yang diperkosa bergilir sama tentara camp Israel. Kemudian korbannya ini, gadis Badui ini yang justru malah dieksekusi. Di sini Adenia tidak mengatakan apa-apa, dia cuma beri deskripsi seperti ini. Darah mengalir dari kepala si gadis ke pasir yang segera menyerapnya. Terik matahari menyorot pantat telanjang si gadis yang warna pasir. Dengan narasi dingin ini, entah kenapa justru kebrutalan itu kerasa banget, nyata banget. Dan dari apa yang saya sampaikan, saya ingin mengatakan bahwa para penulis baru Palestina atau generasi baru, mereka melakukan banyak sekali eksperimen untuk menghadirkan Palestina dengan cara-cara yang baru, dengan cara yang tidak gamblang, seperti saya tadi sempat bilang di presentasi bahwa mereka mencoba mengawinkan antara kepentingan perjuangan dengan kebutuhan artistik seperti itu.
Ya, terima kasih Kak Zulfa. Saya akan